August 31, 1943. The Pacific Ocean burned beneath the rising sun. A single silver shape sliced through the haze, its engine roaring like thunder rolling across the waves. Lieutenant James "Red" O'Neill of the U.S. Navy adjusted his oxygen mask and peered through the canopy. His radar officer's voice crackled through the headset. "Contact, 12 o'clock high. Bandits inbound." Moments later, 6 dark silhouettes materialized against the golden sky. Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, the pride of Japan. Sleek, graceful, deadly. The same aircraft that had humiliated the Allies at Pearl Harbor, that had dominated every dogfight for 2 years, now banked toward a lone newcomer. The American fighter looked wrong, too big, too heavy, too slow. The Japanese leader laughed over the radio. "Another flying pig from the Americans," he sneered. "Let's send it to the bottom." But what happened next would echo across every carrier deck and every hangar in the Pacific. The supposed flying pig didn't turn and run. It rolled sharply, dove straight into the pack, and unleashed 6 streams of .50 caliber fire. 2 Zeros vanished in flame before their pilots even registered the attack. Within seconds, the laughter stopped. This was the birth cry of a new kind of American dominance in the air. The day the Japanese Imperial Navy met the Grumman F6F Hellcat, a machine so brutally efficient that within a year it would erase the Zero from the Pacific skies. At first glance, the Hellcat seemed to defy every rule of aerial combat the Japanese had mastered. It wasn't elegant. It was industrial. It didn't rely on finesse. It relied on brute power and armor. Yet its design carried the cold genius of American engineering, an aircraft born not from theory, but from defeat. Every rivet in its metal skin was a response to a lesson learned in blood at Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway. Every curve of its wings was sculpted by data gathered from wrecked Wildcats and captured Zeros. The Hellcat wasn't just a fighter. It was the embodiment of America's revenge, an industrial answer to Japan's myth of invincibility. What no one on either side realized that morning was that this ungainly blue beast would change the war. Over the next 2 years, it would rack up 5,223 confirmed kills, more than any other U.S. Navy fighter in history. It would destroy the legend of the Zero and crush Japan's air superiority in less than 18 months. But on that first day, high above a sunlit Pacific, all that was still ahead. For now, the Zero pilots only knew one thing. The Americans had built a monster that could climb, dive, and kill faster than anything they had ever seen. The laughter was gone. In its place came disbelief. The Hellcat didn't appear out of American arrogance. It was born from humiliation. In December 1941, when Japanese pilots swept across the Pacific, they didn't just destroy fleets. They dismantled an entire military doctrine. The U.S. Navy entered the war flying the F4F Wildcat, a tough but outdated brawler that was outclassed in almost every way by the nimble Mitsubishi A6M Zero. The Zero was an artist's plane, light, elegant, designed by Jiro Horikoshi with the precision of a samurai's blade. It could climb like smoke and turn inside anything that challenged it. Its pilots, highly trained veterans of China and Pearl Harbor, believed they ruled the sky by divine right. In early 1942, over the Coral Islands of the Pacific, they proved it. Wildcats burned across Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Solomon Islands. American squadrons reported kill ratios so lopsided it bordered on despair. 4, sometimes 5 Wildcats lost for every 0 destroyed. But here's the part that changed everything. America didn't treat those losses as tragedy. It treated them as data. Grumman Aircraft Engineering, based in Bethpage, Long Island, was already working on a replacement for the Wildcat before Pearl Harbor was even attacked. Its lead designer, Leroy Grumman, was a man who looked more like a machinist than an engineer. He had one guiding principle: simplicity wins wars. Where the 0 chased perfection, Grumman chased production. Every design meeting was driven by one question: can we build it fast, fix it fast, and keep it flying no matter what? When wreckage from downed Zeros reached Allied engineers in 1942, the results were shocking. The Japanese had sacrificed everything for agility: armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, even pilot protection. Their planes were masterpieces of lightness, but also flying coffins. The US didn't just learn from that, it weaponized it. Grumman's team redesigned their prototype, adding armor plating behind the pilot, self-sealing tanks, and a massive 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine, the same monster power plant that would later make the P-47 Thunderbolt a legend in Europe. By the time the prototype XF6F flew in June 1942, it was clear something new had been born. A fighter that didn't just fly, it survived. Test pilots joked that the plane could take more punishment than a barroom brawler. One test pilot, Butch O'Hare, America's first Navy ace, summed it up perfectly. "It's not pretty, but it'll kill anything in the sky." The Navy demanded it be rushed into production immediately. Within a year, factories across the East Coast were roaring. Women in bandanas, the Rosies of Grumman's assembly lines, built Hellcats by the thousands. Each one rolled off the line painted in navy blue, its 6 Browning .50 caliber guns gleaming like silver teeth. The Hellcat didn't look revolutionary, but hidden beneath its thick armor was a machine perfectly tuned for the Pacific. It could climb faster than a Wildcat, dive harder than a 0, and, most importantly, take hits that would shred any Japanese plane to pieces. Its arrival wasn't just about a new aircraft. It was the arrival of a new kind of war. A war of industry over artistry, of mass over myth. In 1943, when the first Hellcat squadrons arrived in the Pacific, they carried more than a new design. They carried a message. The age of Japanese air dominance was over. The engineers back in Bethpage called it the Wildcat's big brother. But to the pilots who flew it, the Hellcat felt like something else entirely. Revenge, made of steel and fire. September 1943. The US Navy had been waiting for this moment for almost 2 years. Carrier decks in the Pacific were lined with a new shape: sleek blue fuselages, wide wings, and a brutal growl that made the deck plates tremble. Pilots climbed into their cockpits not with nervousness, but with hunger. They had come to settle a score written since Pearl Harbor. The baptism of fire came at Marcus Island on September 1st, 1943. The Japanese defenders, accustomed to clumsy Wildcats and sluggish, dauntless bombers, scrambled their Zeros with confidence. In minutes, the two air forces collided above the Pacific like ancient warriors meeting on a glass floor of clouds. At first, the Japanese pilots laughed, until they noticed something wrong. The new American planes didn't spiral out after the first burst. They didn't burst into flame when hit. They dove straight through tracer fire and kept coming. Lieutenant Hamilton McWhorter, one of the Navy's first Hellcat aces, later wrote, "You could see their confusion. They'd attack us the way they always had, head-on or in tight turns, and suddenly they were fighting ghosts that wouldn't die." The Hellcat's thicker armor and self-sealing fuel tanks changed everything. Hits that would turn a Zero into a fireball barely scratched its paint, and where the Zero's lightly built frame lost energy in dives, the Hellcat thrived. It could drop like a stone, reach 400 miles per hour in seconds, and climb out again while the Japanese planes fluttered helplessly in its wake. By the end of the Marcus Island raid, Hellcat pilots had claimed 19 kills with no losses. That ratio, 19 to 0, wasn't luck. It was a preview of the storm about to hit the Imperial Japanese Navy. October 1943, Wake Island. The Japanese fighters came screaming in from the sun as they had countless times before. But now, the lumbering American planes met them head-on. In just 2 days, Hellcats shot down 30 enemy aircraft. For the first time since 1941, U.S. pilots ended a battle grinning instead of grieving. One Japanese survivor, Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most respected aces, admitted years later that when he first fought the Hellcat, he felt as though the Americans had read our playbook. Every move he tried, high climbs, tight turns, head-on passes, ended the same way. His Zero out of breath, his opponent still accelerating. The Zero's greatest strength had always been its agility. It could twist and turn tighter than anything else in the sky, but now that strength had turned into a trap. The Hellcat didn't need to turn. It used vertical combat, attacking from above with raw speed, firing short, precise bursts from its 6 heavy guns, then climbing away before the Zero could even react. It was physics, not heroism. The Hellcat's 2,000 horsepower engine gave it a 70-mile-per-hour speed advantage in a dive, and an equal edge in climb. Its rugged frame allowed it to push through maneuvers that would tear a Zero's wings apart. And it had one more advantage: the pilot's life expectancy. The average Japanese naval aviator had been trained for years, hand-picked for skill and loyalty. But by 1943, Japan was bleeding pilots faster than it could replace them. The men now climbing into Zeros had maybe 200 hours of training, barely enough to land safely on a carrier. American pilots, by contrast, arrived with almost 400 hours, and a survival rate that meant they'd fight again, learn again, and get better. Every month that passed widened the gap between experience and extinction. By early 1944, in the skies over Rabaul and the Marianas, the kill ratios had become grotesque. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Hellcats shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day, while losing fewer than 30 of their own. What began as laughter had become horror. The Japanese aces realized too late that they weren't fighting equals anymore. They were fighting an industrial empire that had learned, adapted, and now manufactured death by the thousand. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, America's top Navy ace, once returned from a single sortie over the Philippines with 9 kills in one flight. His voice on the radio was calm, almost casual. "Splash 9, ammo's low, returning to the ship." For the pilots of the Rising Sun, that radio silence afterward was unbearable. The gods of the air had fallen. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. Sunrise over a mirror-flat ocean. The air heavy with humidity and fate. From the decks of 15 American carriers, more than 450 F6F Hellcats waited, their wings folded like the claws of sleeping beasts. Below, the sea shimmered with steel, the heart of the largest carrier fleet ever assembled. Across the horizon, Japan's last hope stirred. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet, 9 carriers, hundreds of Zeros, and the remnants of Japan's once invincible Air Corps, had sailed to meet the Americans head-on. It was meant to be the decisive battle, a rematch of Midway, on Japanese terms. But Ozawa didn't realize he was walking into the industrial age with a sword drawn. At 10:23 a.m., radar operators aboard the USS Lexington picked up the first wave. 40 Japanese bombers and fighters heading straight for the fleet. The order crackled over the radios. "All Hellcats, intercept." Within minutes, the sky was alive. From the decks of the Enterprise, Yorktown, Hornet, and Bunker Hill, wave after wave of Hellcats screamed upward into the blue. Their engines thundered as they broke through the low clouds, forming what one pilot called a storm made of metal. The Japanese came in tight formations, just as they had in 1942. But they were flying into a different world now. American radar guided every interception. Ground controllers fed exact coordinates to squadrons with flawless radio contact, something the Japanese still lacked. The result was slaughter by mathematics. As the first Zeros dived toward the fleet, they were met by walls of tracers, 6 50-caliber streams from every Hellcat, converging like scissors. The sky turned into a killing ground. Lieutenant Alex Vrachu from the Lexington spotted a cluster of 10 enemy bombers at 12,000 feet. He dove into them at 400 miles per hour, firing bursts that lit the bombers like paper lanterns. In 8 minutes, he downed 6. When he landed back on deck, his fuel tank was nearly dry, his voice calm. "How'd we do?" He wasn't alone. By nightfall, American pilots had destroyed over 250 Japanese aircraft. Another 100 were lost to fuel exhaustion or mechanical failure. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese called it something else, Taiho no Higeki, the tragedy of the Great Phoenix. In a single day, Japan's veteran pilot corps ceased to exist. What made the difference wasn't just better planes. It was an entire ecosystem of war. Every Hellcat that took off that morning carried American logistics behind it. Radar tracking from destroyers, anti-aircraft fire directed by analog computers, fuel pipelines stretching thousands of miles, factories in California and New York building spare parts faster than Japan could replace a single aircraft. The F6F was more than a machine. It was a system, a symbol of total industrial warfare. The United States had delivered that air superiority wasn't about who could turn tighter. It was about who could produce, maintain, and sustain faster. By the end of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, 476 Japanese planes had been lost. The U.S. Navy lost just 130 aircraft, most of them to running out of fuel, not to enemy fire. Afterward, American pilots gathered in their mess halls, exhausted and shaken. They just watched the destruction of an entire air force. One wrote in his diary, "It wasn't combat, it was execution." The next morning, Japan's surviving carriers turned east, not in victory, but retreat. They would never again launch a large-scale offensive strike. From that day forward, the rising sun would fight with its wings broken. What the Hellcat had done was not merely win a battle. It had stripped the Japanese military of its most sacred weapon, the myth of invincibility. The aircraft that Japan once mocked as a flying barn had erased the finest air fleet in the Pacific in less than 24 hours. Back on the deck of the Enterprise, A mechanic leaned against the fuselage of a Hellcat, running his hand over bullet holes that hadn't pierced the armor. "She's ugly," he said, "but she brings our boys home." The Hellcat had proven the ultimate truth of modern war. Beauty loses to production. By 1945, the Grumman F6F Hellcat had become more than just a fighter plane. It was the steel embodiment of American retribution. From the Marianas to Iwo Jima, from the Coral Sea to the coast of Japan itself, its deep, throaty engine was the last sound thousands of Japanese pilots ever heard. The statistics alone told the story of an empire collapsing in slow motion. Over 12,000 Hellcats built. More than 5,200 confirmed kills. A kill ratio so obscene, it sounded like propaganda. 19-1. No other fighter in World War II, Allied or Axis, even came close. But behind those numbers lay something deeper, a shift in the very philosophy of warfare. For decades, nations had believed that victory in the sky belonged to the gifted few, to the lone ace with lightning reflexes and perfect instincts. Japan had built its air force on that mythology. Its training schools were temples of discipline, producing elite warriors in small numbers. The Zero was their katana, light, elegant, lethal in a master's hands. The Hellcat ended that world. It didn't rely on myth. It relied on method. Any farm kid from Kansas or mechanic from Detroit could climb into a Hellcat, follow its training manual, and within months, become a deadly pilot. The plane was engineered not for the exceptional, but for the average man. Its controls were intuitive, its systems forgiving, its construction so durable that even a sloppy landing wouldn't kill you. It was war stripped of romance, efficiency defeating elegance. This was the brutal genius of the American war machine. It democratized destruction. When the war began, Japan's greatest advantage was spiritual, the belief that devotion and courage could compensate for material inferiority. But courage couldn't stop 50 caliber rounds, and faith couldn't outclimb a Pratt & Whitney R2800. Every Hellcat rolling off the Grumman production line was another nail in that coffin. By mid-1944, the Imperial Navy was a ghost. The U.S. Navy ruled the Pacific sky so completely that by 1945, Japanese pilots were sent on one-way suicide missions. Not out of strategy, but desperation. They called it kamikaze, divine wind. It was supposed to terrify the Americans. Instead, it symbolized surrender in disguise. The admission that Japan had no other way to fight. And the Hellcat met even that with cold, mechanical calm. Its 6 Browning guns, its rugged frame, and its unmatched speed shredded wave after wave of suicide planes before they ever reached the fleet. The machine born from defeat had become the shield of the Pacific. When the war ended in August 1945, the world expected the Hellcats to fade into scrapyards, relics of a specific era, built for a specific enemy. But they didn't disappear. For years, they flew in the navies of Britain, France, and even post-war Japan. The ultimate irony. The very nation that once mocked it, now trained with it. And in those quiet hangars, a strange truth took root. The Hellcat hadn't just won a war. It had rewritten the logic of air combat, forever. It taught future generations that engineering, logistics, and adaptability mattered more than heroism. It proved that wars weren't won by the most skilled, but by the most prepared. When the jet age dawned, that philosophy carried straight into the designs of the F-86 Sabre, the F-4 Phantom, and eventually, the F-14 Tomcat. All descendants in spirit of that clumsy-looking beast from 1943. But for the men who flew her, the Hellcat wasn't an abstraction or a symbol. It was a friend that brought them home. Lieutenant Alex Vraciu, the ace who downed 6 planes in 8 minutes, said it best years later when asked what made the Hellcat special. He smiled and answered simply, "She forgave your mistakes." That was the secret. In a war where perfection had died in the clouds above Midway, the plane that forgave its pilots ended up ruling the skies. When the smoke cleared, the Pacific was silent. The rising sun had set, and over the ocean stretched a new empire. One powered by factories, fueled by industry, and carried on the wings of the Grumman Hellcat.